Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk about planting depth in corn, soybeans, and maybe a couple other crops too, Darren. And you know, right before we got started here, Darren and I were just talking about mesocotyl and hypocotyl.
Well, it's been a year since we planted corn and soybeans, Brad. We got to refresh ourselves in some of these parts of the plants. You know, it's one of those really profitable things that you have to keep in the back of your mind. Huh?
But you know, it doesn't really matter what it is, whether it's the mesocotyl or hypocotyl. There are certain reasons why we want to plant our corn at a certain depth, or our soybeans, or whatever crop it is, and we wanted to get into that. So if you're a non-farmer, you can kind of understand some of the things that farmers do have to go through, and that there's a big difference from one plant to the next. You don't plant all your crops at exactly 2 inches deep, for example.
Well, here's the place to start. When we look at corn, that's a grass crop. When we look at soybeans, it's a broadleaf crop. Completely different crops, because you see with corn, that seed stays right in the ground, right where you placed it. But with soybeans, if you placed a soybean seed right by the corn seed, well, the two halves of the soybean seed actually become the first two leaves on the soybean plant. So that seed has to lift up out of the ground and become the first two leaves. So obviously you don't want to plant that too deep. Now with corn, you say, well, wait a minute, if that seed stays right where it's placed, why does this planting depth make such a big difference?
Well, the reason why is because with corn, the main roots of the plant are called the nodal roots, and they actually come out above where the seed is. I know it might seem a little weird. You'd think, well, from the seed, then all the roots are going to come out below, but that is not the case at all. So when you have some roots up above the seed, you have to have some space there for those roots to come out. And typically those roots, those nodal roots, are going to come out within about a 3/4 inch distance from the top to the bottom. Also, there's this mesocotyl that's about 3/4 of an inch at a minimum. So if you've got 3/4 of an inch for the mesocotyl, you've got 3/4 of an inch for the roots, you have to be a minimum of 1.5 inches deep when you plant corn. Always, there is no exception to that rule. So if you are, let's say, 1 inch deep is all, then what's going to happen is some of the nodal roots are going to come out above ground. Now, I'm not talking brace roots. Brace roots are supposed to come out above ground. You just don't want the nodal roots to come out above ground. When you have those come out above ground, you're going to have much worse stability for the plant, and you're not going to bring in nearly as much water and nutrients as if you had planted just a little bit deeper.
Now what happens when you plant a little deeper on corn is that mesocotyl is just going to be just a little bit longer. Those nodal roots will still take about 3/4 of an inch, but that mesocotyl will adjust. So if you plant it 2.5 inches deep, which is still in a safe range, but you're a little bit deeper, now that mesocotyl will just be 1 inch longer than it would if you were planting at 1.5 inches deep.
Darren mentioned the 2.5 inch depth. 1.5 to 2.5 inches deep is where corn should be planted. If a farmer is to plant his corn at 3 inches or 4 inches deep, then we can run into some problems. Probably not a big deal, but occasionally corn will, what they call, leaf out underground. That's obviously not good. It needs to leaf out above ground. The other thing is it takes so much energy to push that corn up above the ground that the farmer's given up some yield. The corn plant just doesn't do as well. Now, one important question that goes along with this, a lot of farmers are rolling their ground, whether they're planting corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa. They go over with a roller, which kind of packs that surface of the soil down. So farmers have asked, should I roll before I plant the corn or after? And the answer is always before you plant the corn, because what can happen is if you have kind of light fluffy soil in a spring, you plant the corn at, you think, 2 inches deep, well then you go over with the roller and realize, uh-oh, now it's only planted at 1 inch deep when I back that ground down. That's not good, because you're going to have nodal roots coming out above ground. So again, ideal planting depth is 1.5 to 2.5 inches for corn, and make sure if you're going to roll the ground, that's done before planting the corn, not after.
What I like about this whole discussion, Brian, is we've been talking for 5 minutes here already, and all we've got to is one little consideration a farmer has planting, and that's how deep are you going to put that seed.
And we've only talked mainly about corn. How about what's the right planting depth for soybeans, Darren?
Well, we like to plant soybeans at 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep.
Why?
Well, soybeans, it's a whole different animal, and when I say inch to 1.5 inches deep, there's a couple things we're looking at. Again, that soybean is going to push the two halves of the seed out of the ground, so you don't want to be real deep, or you're going to have a tough time pushing those great big halves of the seed out of the ground. So 1.5 inches is really as deep as you should go on beans. But I say that you want to be at least 1 inch deep, and the reason why is that top inch of soil can dry out quickly. So you may get enough moisture to get a seed to germinate, but then with one good hot windy day, now that top inch is all dry and that seed could just wither and die. So you want to be real cautious about that. The other thing is the temperature fluctuation in that top inch is great. So if you're down a little bit deeper, 1.5 inches deep, you're in a better position with that soybean seed to keep it safe.
All right, Darren, just to completely change gears on you here, how about weeds? Where do a lot of weeds like to germinate from? Let's take foxtail, some of the most common grass weeds that you have. How deep are they actually germinating in the soil?
Well, with most of the weeds that we're fighting, we're dealing with them germinating in the top 1/2 inch or even 1/4 inch of soil. A lot of them are right up towards the surface. And many times what happens is when you're doing spring tillage, whether that's with your planter running through and just stirring some soil up, or whether you're actually doing some heavy tillage out there, you're actually exposing those weed seeds to sunlight. And it seems weird that exposing them to sunlight is just going to trigger them to germinate, but
For
that's
a
what
fraction
happens.
of a second even,
Yeah,
if they
it
get exposed.
doesn't take much time. And some university studies have been done with night tillage, and they have actually less weed germination when they do the tillage at night. Now, it sounds crazy, and I'm not telling you, well, you got to do everything at night because your neighbors are going to think you're nuts, for one thing. And another thing is you'll never get any sleep. But when you're out in the field, just think about that. Most of those weeds are in the very top 1/2 inch or so of soil. Now, there are some that are going to be deeper, but a majority of them are up high. So when you're putting your herbicides out, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, you want to make sure you have a good concentration of herbicide right in that weed germination zone.
Well, once again, it does vary depending on the type of crop you're planting in terms of how deep you want to plant that crop. But again, the ideal depth for corn is 1.5 inches to 2.5 inches, and the ideal depth for soybeans is 1 to 1.5 inches.
And unfortunately for all of us, our weed of the week can germinate all over the place. It might be shallow, it might be a little bit deeper. We'll explain what will control it coming up later in the show.